Welcome everyone, it's Otto here. Today's topic we will be discussing how we can connect to Apache Kafka broker that is running inside a Docker container. So lots of people have troubles with connecting to the broker, especially if it's running in the container. After watching this video, you will know all the details to connect to Kafka, right? Because we will go with different scenarios which you will come across. So before I jump into the Docker and starting the broker, I open this server.properties that comes with Kafka. Without Docker, without anything, I just downloaded Kafka, right? I have Kafka here, and if I go to bin, not bin, but config, and if I go to this server.properties, it will show this file. And this is basically file where you can configure your Kafka broker. Now, when it comes to connecting with Kafka Broker, there are three sorts of main parts. One is the listeners that is listed here and commented. The second one is advertised listeners, and the third one is listener security protocol map. Right. So we will go through these properties because these are the key in order to understand how we can connect to Kafka Broker. Now you can also read the description here. Basically, the listener is the socket configuration for the broker that the broker will use to get the traffic, and it has the URL format. The first one is the listener name or listener protocol name. The second one is host name, and the third one is port. Right? So for example, let me actually uncomment it. What would be one typical listener? We can give any name in the listener name. I can call it, for example, my listener. Now, obviously, we'll give more meaningful name, but this is just for example. We can also give the host name, but if we want to bind it to the specific network interface, but typically people omit it so that it is bind to all available interfaces. But we can also bind it to specific one, for example, localhost, if we wanted to. In this case, I will just omit. And the port, let's put it 1992, right? So this would be a typical example of a listener. Now, what is the advertised listener, right? Advertised listener, basically, in this property, we tell the clients, which is producers and the consumers, how they can reach Kafka broker, right? And if it's not configured, it will use this list, which in many cases creates the problem. And let me actually open this picture here. By the way, this picture is from the book called Effective Kafka, which I highly recommend to check it out. It's a really great book. And it explains it explains how clients connect to Kafka broker in this picture. And let's assume there is some sort of private network and we have three brokers and we have one client, right? And those are running on different machines. So first step is to connect to random broker, right? So this internal client should have some sort of IP address in the Bootstrap list, Bootstrap server list, to connect to at least one broker, right? In this case, it connects to broker 0. And after this connection is successful, it downloads this metadata. Now, what is in this metadata? There are lots of things, but one major thing is the list of advertised listeners for this broker and for other brokers. So it actually returns the list that we will configure here. If we omit it, it will return this list, which again, in many cases, it creates the problems. And I will show you why it creates the problems. So let me tell you that each broker in the cluster has a complete view of other brokers. So even though we connected to broker 0 knows what is the advertised listener of broker 1 and broker 2. Same, for example, broker 1 knows what is advertised listeners of broker 0 and broker 2. And whatever we get in advertised listeners, that address will be used for subsequent calls, right? So any address we specify in Bootstrap server list, right, it's only for the initial connection. For subsequent connections, the clients use the address from advertised listeners. That's why it's extremely important to configure this advertised listener properly. Let's actually configure it. Now, this is obviously just an example to show you a theoretical example. We will get our hands dirty and I will show you in practice. So what would be a typical advertised listener in this case? First of all, we need to advertise the listeners, right? So the listener name comes here. Again, we are advertising this listener, which is called my listener. So obviously we have that name, exact name here also. And in this case, let's assume our client is on the same host as our broker. So we'll just say localhost here, and the port stays the same. Right? Let's assume we have this kind of setup in this case, right? Let me make it smaller. In this case, so this client connects to the broker and gets this property localhost 9092. Now, in this picture, the client is on different host machine. Will it create a problem or not? Can it use this address for subsequent connections? Well, it cannot use this address for subsequent connections because it's running on a different host machine. So localhost for this client is different than localhost on this broker, right? But if they were running on the same host machine, in this case, this would work, right? And in this case, even if we did not define the advertised listeners, it would still work because the broker and the client is on the same host machine, and we are not using any Docker or any containers in this case, right? So sometimes you can get away with not defining advertised listeners, but in many cases it creates a problem if we don't define it in a correct way. And again, it has this URL format, the name of the listener that we want to advertise, the host name, and the port. And there is another property called Listener Security Protocol Map, where we map our custom names, and this is our custom name that we can name anything. We can map it to valid predefined security protocol. For example, I just mapped my listener to plaintext. Plaintext is a valid security protocol, predefined. I cannot change its name. And it basically means that clients, in this case producers and consumers, they don't need to authenticate with the broker, and the data between them will be unencrypted, right? There's also other protocols like SSL for encryption, SSL, etc. We will be using the plaintext, which is like the most basic one to simplify things. Okay, so first glance, we know that the listeners is just the socket configuration for the broker. Advertised listeners are how clients, producers, consumers will reach our broker. And if we don't define, the list of listeners will be returned, which creates the problems in many cases. And in Listener Security Protocol Map, we just map our custom listener names, for example, my listener here, to valid predefined security protocol names. Okay, so let's get started with running our broker in Docker. By the way, we can configure this file server.properties if we are running Kafka without Docker, but in our case, we're running it in Docker, so we don't need this file. So let me close this, don't save. And I have a Docker Compose file here on my desktop, which we will use to run our Kafka broker in Docker. So if you don't know how to run Kafka using Docker Compose, I actually have a video about it, and you can watch it. We basically define two main services, the Zookeeper and the Kafka, And we are also creating our custom network, which we give a name of Kafka Docker example net. And we also obviously specify this here. So our services, Zookeeper and Kafka, will be associated with this network. Okay, and pay attention that in Docker we configure the listeners with this property, Kafka underscore listeners. We configure advertised listeners with this property and security protocol with this property. Now, as you can see, I have 3 listeners, basically separated with commas. You can have many listeners. You separate just commas. Same goes with advertised listeners, and same goes with security protocol maps, right? So I have an internal listener here, which I gave it the name of internal because in this case, internal means that we want to connect to Kafka Broker within the same Docker network, right? That's why I called it internal. You could have named it differently. Listener names are absolutely up to you to name, right? And I omit this host IP address in all listeners, which means that it will bind to all available interfaces in the Docker container, because this broker will be running in Docker container, right? So let me actually run it. So I have my terminal here. I'm on the desktop folder. So I will say docker compose app to start our services. Hit enter, and it will start our services. It will create Zookeeper and Kafka containers. Let me actually open another terminal here to check the status, and I can say docker ps for short, and it lists running containers, and we have our Kafka and Zookeeper running. So what I want to do now is to log in this container and show you what ports are exposed for the broker. So I'll say docker exec -it for interactive terminal. We will specify that we want to log in as root, and we should specify the name of the container, which is Kafka, and the program that we want to run, which is bash. Okay, I misspelled Docker, and we are in the container, right? So to check the ports and sockets, we need some net utilities. We need to install them first. So we'll say net tools, yum install net tools, and it will download those tools from Confluent repository. It generally takes like a couple of seconds, and it's done. And I can say netstat -an, and it lists all the sockets, active sockets, and the ports. And we can see here that the port that we defined, so let me actually put this together if I may. Yeah, so pay attention to this listener, which is 1992, and we omitted the host, so it bound to all available interfaces. So these 4 zeros is meta address, which means that it is bind to all available interfaces. If we put localhost here, for example, something like that, localhost, it will only bind to localhost, right? And you might be asking, okay, what are some available interfaces in this container? Let's check with if config command, and we see the loopback interface, which is the localhost, and it also has the another interface with this IP address that Docker basically gives this container, right? So it's bind to the port 1992, basically listens on both interfaces in this case. Okay, what do you think? What should we advertise for internal listener? So I put this here. So we're advertising internal listener, and I put the address how others in the same Docker network can reach this broker. And if you know Docker, if the containers are on the same Docker network, they can reach each other with just container and names. That's why I put it Kafka here, because the container name is Kafka, and obviously the port that socket listens on, right? And so if we want to start a container in the same network, this address should be used. So let me actually exit this because we don't need to be inside the container. Clear. And let's start Kafka console producer, which will be running in a container in the same Docker network as we had this broker, which is this network. Okay, so I actually have a command here that I don't want to type, so I will just copy here. So we're basically running a container from this image that we use for Kafka broker, and we are specifying that to put this container in the same Docker network as these services are, right? And we are executing this Kafka console producer script. We specify the Bootstrap server list, basically how we can reach Kafka for initial connection. Again, Bootstrap server list is for initial connection only, and we use the same address here as we had in advertised listeners. And we're specifying the topic, which is just any topic name. The topic will be created automatically if it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in our case, so it will be created. So let me just hit enter, and it should try and give us this greater sign. And let's produce in the topic. Now it gives us this warning, but don't pay attention to this. This means that the connection was successful, the initial connection. Again, I will bring this file again, a picture. So the initial connection, and then we get the metadata, which contains the advertised listener list. In this case, we connected here on internal listener, and we get back the advertised listeners of internal listener, which is basically this address. And for subsequent connections, this Kafka console producer, as any other Kafka client, will use this list, not the address that we specify in Bootstrap server. It will use the address that we specify in advertised listener for that listener. Okay. By the way, just a side note, it doesn't return all advertised listeners because we just connected to internal listener, which means that it will return the address for internal listener. It will not return this address, for example, because we don't need it, right? And if we had other brokers, as it is in the picture, it also would return the advertised listeners for other brokers as well, right? Also, side note, the listener names should be identical for all brokers in the cluster, right? So when I have internal listener here, I also should have the same listener name for other brokers. Just a side note. Okay, how can we really verify that the connection was successful and everything is good? So what I will do here, I will create another terminal and I will run the consumer. So this is just a producer. It produces to our broker, and let's run the consumer and verify that we can consume the message. So instead of producer, let me specify the consumer here. Hit enter. It doesn't do anything because it waits for me to produce. So let's produce something, and we should see it below. And we see it below here. Let me actually produce some messages. Hello. This is same Docker network, and we see that the message is consumed here. Now this means that our setup, our advertised listener setup, works as expected. Okay, so let me actually close these consumers and producers. Let me actually remove this if I may, but for some reason it's stuck. Okay, not this. Yeah. Let's remove it. Now I want to do one experiment here also. I want to change this address and let's put it Kafka 9093. Will we experience the problems or not? I think you should also already know the answer that we will experience some problems. So let me stop this Docker Compose and clean everything. So we start fresh again. I will start our services again because I changed the compose file and I need to restart. Clear, check the containers. And for some reason, our consumer container is not dead. It's okay. I will just remove it. Okay, container remove -f. Oh, -f is wrong here. No problem. So we removed our console container, which should be removed. And we have our Kafka and Zookeeper, and we changed these from 9092 to 9093. So let me start our producer once again. And I specify the bootstrap list as 1992 because the socket for the broker listens on 1992 and the name of the container is Kafka. So initial connection should be fine. Initial connection should be fine. Hit enter. It shows this sign, greater sign. And if I try to, for example, produce something, it gives me warnings. It doesn't stop. Why is that? Because after the initial connection is successful, and we didn't see any errors, right? Until I started to produce. For subsequent calls, it uses this address. And since there is nothing on port 1993, right, we have 1992 here, it cannot connect to this broker. It could connect initially with bootstrap list, but after this initial connection, we got back this address, Kafka 1993, which our console producer will use, and there is nothing on 1993. Therefore, it just spams the warnings that it cannot connect. So we know that this address that we specify here really matters. All right, we saw how to connect to the broker from the same Docker network. We basically expose our broker, we reach our broker with just a container name here, which in this case is Kafka. And by the way, in security protocol map, I map this internal protocol to plaintext as well as other listeners. I map all of them to plaintext for simplicity, right? Now, how can we connect this broker from just host machine, right, without any Docker? Let's say our client, we have console producer that is not running in the Docker, it's just running on our host machine. How do we connect? For that, I created another listener. I named it external same host, and I omitted the interface, so it will bind to all available interfaces. And I use different ports, 29092. Typically, for different listeners, you use different ports. And there is also advertised listeners. Obviously, for that, we are advertising our listener, which is external same host. And for host name, we put a localhost. Basically, we are saying to our client that will be running on the host machine to use the localhost and use this port. Obviously, this port, which is 29092, should be accessible outside Docker. So that's why I published this port here. Now, this is not something Kafka specific. This is Docker, that if you want to access the port in the container, you need to publish it. So I want to access this port inside the container because the broker's socket, one of the sockets, will be listening on this port, and I want to expose it outside Docker, and that's why I list these ports here. Basically, when I go to localhost 29092, it will redirect traffic to our our broker in the container. And for this listener, I also map it to plain text. So let's actually run, not run, but to try to connect. I obviously have this running, our Kafka. I didn't stop it, so I have Kafka and Zookeeper. Now I need the console producer on my host machine, on my laptop, right? So for that, I actually go to the Kafka that I downloaded, and I will go to bin, and I will have my Kafka console producer here. So I need to cd here, great. And we need to specify Kafka console producer. So Kafka console producer.ch. I think we can omit it, but let's put it here. Bootstrap list, bootstrap server, which is basically the same as we specify here. And topic, let's say test topic 2. You can name it anything, it will be created automatically. And let's try. Oh, it's not recognized. Okay, let's omit sh. Yeah. And I think that we can produce something. So let's say hello, and use these warnings, but it's not. It doesn't mean that we couldn't connect. And we can also start, as we did before, we can also start the consumer. So I will start the consumer here. Let's do this, and I will basically copy this command, which is Kafka console producer, but instead of producer, I will use consumer. Hit enter. And let's produce something, for example, hello from the host. And we see that it's printed here, which means that the initial connection and subsequent connections where this address is used was successful, meaning that we have advertised listeners configured correctly, right? So let me stop this consumer and producer, and this also. Now there is also another scenario that will be useful, I think, when Kafka broker is running on external server. In this case, we will be running this broker on DigitalOcean. So I actually have a DigitalOcean server here with this IP address, and I have Kafka running there. Now for that, I created again another listener. So for these different situations, you typically create different listeners, and I called it external different host, right? And for port, I choose 29093, and obviously I advertise it here. And what do I need to use here? I cannot use localhost for the host name, because it is running on a different machine. It's running in cloud, and localhost for cloud machine is different than localhost for my laptop, right? So I need to specify the IP address here, which is this IP address basically, and the port. And don't forget that we also publish that ports. This is purely for Docker, that this port is reachable outside Docker container. This is just Docker, not related to Kafka. So let's actually try to produce something here. For that, I will start the producer, but instead of localhost, I need to specify this address, right? This address, and the port is 3. Let's call it topic test 3. So I will start, and I will also start the consumer right away. Basically, I will copy this, and let me paste it here. And topic 3. Started consumer producer. Hello from remote server, and we see the same message here, which means that uh, initial connection with Bootstrap server list, and subsequent connections where this address is returned was successful, meaning that our advertised listeners are configured correctly. Just a side note, in typical scenarios, you do not hard code the IP address because IP addresses might change all the time. People typically use the domain names, like you can, for example, have something broker zero, my company.com, something like that. Uh, because it's very easy to update like DNS names to point to valid IP address. Then hard coding IP address, because IP addresses, especially in the cloud, and especially if you're using Docker and Kubernetes, they change all the time. So it's better to use the DNS names instead of hard coding IP addresses. Okay, let's quickly summarize what we learned and what we did. We understood that in order to properly connect to Kafka, we need to understand what is a listener, what is advertised listener, and what is a security protocol map. We saw that the listener is just the socket configuration for the broker for incoming TCP connections. We also learned that advertised listeners are basically a way to tell the clients, producers, or consumers how they can reach Kafka brokers. And the security protocol map, in security protocol map, we just map our custom listener names to valid predefined security names, right? The listeners and advertised listeners have URL format where we specify the listener name first, then we specify the host name, and then we specify the port. We also discussed 3 cases of connectivity with Kafka Broker. Firstly, we saw how we could connect to Kafka Broker from the same Docker network, and we basically said that we need to use the containers, Kafka containers name, because this is how Docker network works, that you can reach other containers by their container names. We also saw how we could connect from the same host when client is running on the same host without any Docker. We just use localhost in this case and different port. And finally, we saw how we could connect to external Kafka broker, which is running in the cloud, for example, and we used the IP address of the server, and typically people use the DNS name because it's easier to update DNS names. And we used different port. So we had 3 listeners. We advertised the same 3 listeners, and each listener has different ports. This was all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.